Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to our international audience. Today's session is called Can We Do Better? Climate Science and Colonialism, and it is the first of two events of the Education Working Group of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse project of the World Climate Research Program. I am Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez. I'm coming to you from the Ateneo de Manila University Hub. And joining me behind the scenes also from the Ateneo Hub is Jean Hardelesa Mijares. I'll be your MC for today. So to get the ball rolling, I would like to welcome the co-chair of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity, Dr. Regina Rodriguez, for some opening remarks.
Hi, can I share the slides? It says that I cannot now. Oh, okay, good. Okay, just a quick introduction here of My Climate Risk. I'm Regina Rodriguez from the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Brazil, and I'm co-chair of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity with Ted Shepherd, that couldn't be here today with us, from the University of Reading in the UK. And I want to thank you, all the organized committee, to having me here to say a few words about My Climate Risk. So the new science that then is pictured by within My Climate Risk is not around models or observations or process understanding, but on how they are all used together within a context of deep uncertainty. Specifically, My Climate Risk aims to develop a mainstream, a bottom-up approach to regional climate risk, which starts from the decision context and the decision scale, and enables relevant climate information to be brought into that context. And we wanted to make this happening by developing a new framework for assessing and explaining regional climate risk using all available sources of climate information. We expect the climate information will be made meaningful at the local scale. So in this sense, we reflected on the insights provided in a different context, that of economics, by E.F. Schumacher in his celebrated book, Small is Beautiful, from 1973, to see what light they might shed on the challenge of inverting the construction of a climate information for local to regional climate risk. And Schumacher asked how economics might look if it was structured as if people mattered. And we asked the same question for climate change and science, and find many parallels. Right. One is the need to deal with the complexity of a local situations, which can be addressed by expressing climate knowledge in a conditional form. A second is the importance of simplicity when dealing with deep uncertainty, which can be addressed through the use of the physical climate storylines. And a third is the need to empower local communities to make sense of their own situation, which can be addressed by developing intermediate technologies that build trust and transparency. That's why we propose our structure around a non-hierarchical ecosystem of labs, communities of practice, like a Michael network, sharing resources rather than competing for them, and anchored by modern trees in the form of a regional hubs, similar to the concept of the Wide Woods Web by Susan Simard. These are our current hubs, and I'm thrilled to have 9 hubs in the Global South out of our 14 hubs, all sharing our principles. So this is a fantastic webinar series. I say a safe place to drive discussion and insights from different community sectors and experience to achieve more actionable climate research and to promote a more open and equal concept of collaboration that can help sensitize the global north to the way that climate science is done in the global south. So with that, I wish you a very fruitful series. And with that, I thank you for sharing our principles. Thanks for being part of My Climate Risk, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Regina, for that overview of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse project. As was shared, the My Climate Risk Hubs are attempting to build a bottom-up understanding of the experience of climate risk. And we know that that experience of climate risk is mediated by different structures and different factors. And we perhaps need to open our eyes and interrogate some of the things that may go unnoticed but are nevertheless deeply ingrained. Hence, the theme of this series on climate and colonialism. To say more about this initiative of the Education Working Group, I call on the lead of the working group, Dr. Vandana Singh from Framingham State University.
Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Regina. Greetings to everybody on behalf of the MCR Education Working Group. We'd like to acknowledge the invaluable help of the WCRP Secretariat and the Conference Services team and the Manila Hub for making this event possible. We are very grateful also for the encouragement of Regina Rodriguez and Ted Shepard, our co-leads of MCR. So the question before us is, what does science and climate science in particular have to do with colonialism? We know that when it comes to climate impacts, it is the colonized and marginalized peoples of the world who bear the larger burden due to the enduring legacy of imperialism and colonialism. But what about the science? Most of my colleagues in My Climate Risk are climate scientists, and I'm a physicist. Physical scientists are used to thinking of science as something separate from the social context and objective, value-free enterprise. Colonialism and its impacts are not part of our formal education. Yet, consider this famous 1872 painting by John Gast titled American Progress. The woman here represents manifest destiny. You can see that she's bringing a book with her, and she's carrying a wire representing knowledge, science, and technology. Behind her come the colonial settlers of North America, the light of Western civilization coming to the North American shores, before which flee native peoples and non-human inhabitants of the continent. There's nothing subtle about this painting. Of course, we are besieged by other forms of colonialism than nations, going to other lands and dominating the people there. All around the world, including in the global south, there are internal oppressions and power hierarchies, and what might be referred to as perhaps internal colonialism as well, with the disposition, for example, of native peoples in the name of progress. As I said, none of this is part of the education of physical scientists. This gap is acutely felt by my colleagues who are climate scientists working with communities on the ground to make climate information relevant, meaningful, and actionable for local people. And it's more evident than ever that climate crisis is a transdisciplinary problem with concerns of justice and power at its core. Perhaps it's not surprising that conventional education has failed to live up to the climate challenge. Through today and tomorrow, our speakers will help us understand the entanglement of climate science and colonialism. Their insights will take us across time and space, in some cases giving us a wider historical perspective, in other cases shining a light on specific locales. In an attempt to break the mold of the conventional webinar a little, we've asked them to begin with a quote that means something to them and is relevant to our topic in any language of their choosing. Before I invite my colleague Kendra to introduce today's distinguished panel, I want to remind everyone that this event continues tomorrow at 13:30 hours UTC. Tomorrow, we'll have the privilege of listening to Yamina Sahib, Margaret Rudolph, Rohan Deb Roy, and Andrei Poljak, speaking to us on such varied subjects as coloniality in climate scenarios, co-production of knowledge with Alaskan Native communities, a long view on the relationship of science and colonialism, and the prevalence of coloniality in ocean policy, among many other things. We hope you'll join us tomorrow as well. I invite Kendra to introduce today's speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Vandana. Thank you for laying the foundations of our discussion today. I think this really promises to be a thought-provoking conversation, and we hope it will be that, a conversation between our panelists and the rest of the audience. So it is my privilege to introduce our distinguished panel today. We have Dr. Lyla Mehta, who is a sociologist and development studies scholar at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. Her work focuses on water and sanitation, climate change, transformation, rights, resource grabbing, and the politics of sustainability, scarcity, and uncertainty. She has played an advisory role in a number of UN agencies and is active in advocacy on gender, environment, and development issues. My colleague at the Ateneo de Manila University Hub is Dr. Nikki Carey-Cruz, who is a Southeast Asian Studies and Cultural Studies scholar. She is the chair of the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies and editor of Perspectives in the Arts and Humanities Asia. She teaches interdisciplinarity, peace and nonviolence, and environmental history. Joining us also is Dr. Harriet Mercer, historian and interdisciplinary scholar of climate history at the University of Cambridge. She is especially interested in understanding the changing ways that atmospheric data has been collected, analyzed, and represented over time as part of her work as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge, associated with the Making Climate History project. And last but certainly not the least, we have Dr. Thomas Simpson, an environmental historian at the University of Warwick. His research and teaching lie at the intersection of environmental history, history of science, and imperial and colonial history. He has established interest in histories of upland and riverine spaces, the history of cartography and anthropology, the interaction of European imperial and non-Western knowledge systems, and the question of how history should be written and taught in the Anthropocene. So these are our 4 speakers for today. So as we go along the talks, we encourage the audience, if something comes to mind, you can use the Q&A function of the Zoom room to type your questions. But if you have other comments aside from questions, then you are welcome to use the chat function. Each speaker has about 15 to 18 minutes to discuss the topic, after which we will take a few burning questions. But no worries, we will have a lengthier time for question and answers later on in the program. So if we were not able to get to your question immediately, we will do so later. So without further ado, I call on our first speaker, Dr. Lyla.
Hi, can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Looks great, Lyla.
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much to Vandana and colleagues for inviting me to speak in today's exciting webinar. I'm going to talk about how we can address coloniality, decoloniality in sustainability and climate sciences, and also focus on some examples of ways why that's important and how we've done it in a couple of projects. So I'll draw on 2 projects, the Tapestry project and the project on uncertainty and climate change. And the research has largely taken place in India and also Bangladesh. And it's a collaboration across 5 countries, the UK, Bangladesh, India, Norway, and Japan. And we have multiple funders. So, and also before I start, I'm the messenger. I owe whatever I'm saying and all my insights to obviously the communities in the areas where we've worked, the scientists, and a whole host of collaborators, and also our funders, and all of them are listed above. So the Tapestry project was funded by the Transformations to Sustainability program with multiple funders, the EU, the Belmont Forum and others, and the Uncertainty Project by the Research Council of Norway. Now, Vandana did ask us to start in a different way. So I was really struggling. Just shows how hopeless we are in some ways as academics. But Vandana suggested I draw on my own Zoroastrian tradition. I'm not very religious, but I was culturally born into the Zoroastrian tradition. And obviously it's molded the way I am, even though I'm not a religious person. But what's critical is the links between the 7 holy spirits or immortals and the 7 holy creations. I've always found that very compelling. So the 7 creations are, as you see, sky, earth, water, plants, animals, humans, and fire. And then there are 7 mortals, and that's over and above the god Ahura Mazda. And I think the Hashem Wahu prayer is very compelling because it focuses on Asha and all the beauty of nature molded by Ahura Mazda is expressed through Asha. So mountains, oceans, rivers, gardens, etc. And the beautiful sky are all expressions of this order. So while I said I'm not religious, I guess Vandana said I'm working a lot on water and the environment, and maybe that has something to do with my with the tradition I was in, and you know the need to really ensure that there's all these interconnections. So what am I going to focus on today? I'm focusing on the contested notion of sustainability and coloniality, and also, and I'm actually drawing a lot on issues of uncertainty. So it's great to be part of this WCRP webinar. We've worked a lot on uncertainty in these 2 projects, and in a way in parallel, but now increasingly we've been working together, Vandana, Ted, myself, and I've also been inspired by some of the stuff you've written. So it's really good to be here today. Also talking about how to conceptualize how climate is often, the differences in conceptualizing climate and uncertainty from above, middle, and below, a kind of heuristic examples of how to challenge some of these post-colonial, colonial, and Western biases, and some of the ways forward. Now, as Vandana said, you know, classically colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring control over a territory or land and occupying it by settlers and exploiting it. And indigenous people around the world, as well as countries in the majority world, have experienced that. But there's other kinds of colonialism that we increasingly need to focus on: the colonizing of the mind or science, the way we work, we think, we believe, and the practices and what that means. And of course, internal colonialism in every country. So elite biases and the violence that is faced through issues of colonialism due to caste, class, ethnicity, gender. So you're really unpacking some of that is really, really critical. So why does this actually matter? You know, sustainability sciences or even climate sciences, all of them are seeking to make sense of the world, or how does a system support itself? How do we live? How do we kind of safeguard the planet? Sustainability, for example, refers to maintaining or supporting a system over time, and it's linked to these 3 different pillars: economic, environmental, and social. How do we juggle trade-offs? Whose interest counts? All these are very, very political. And as you see this land here, it means different things to different people. For the pastoralists, it's their home. It really is a productive piece of land, but for a developer, it's empty and barren. And climate scientists will be looking at changes over time, you know, what has changed in the atmosphere. So it seems like these sciences are neutral, but actually they're deeply shaped by legacies of coloniality and colonialism, patterns of thinking, institutional structures, flows of money and resources. And these persist from times of colonies and empires. And they're also very full of hidden biases, and they're poorly equipped to deal with the rich and diverse knowledges of people in different settings around the world. And they often perpetuate racialized, gender, and colonial biases. So, you know, the term sustainability was coined in the 18th century by a German forester to prescribe how forests should be managed on a long-term basis. And this remained a thread in environmental policies that emerged amidst periods of imperial and colonial expansion and their consolidation in colonial and post-colonial policies. So many practices in this period and even today are geared to economic profit, and these focus on rapid exploitation and of natural resources in most parts of the global south. And so the social consequences of these policies are devastating, and they were accompanied by slavery, racialized discrimination, and the grabbing of lands and livelihoods with exploitative and degrading labor practices. And these forms of exploitation, dispossession still continue today. So today you have conservation projects which try to remove people from the land. In the name of climate change, you often people are made to forced out of so-called marginalized lands. A lot of local users of the land are labeled as primitive or environmental destroyers, which justifies their removal, restriction, or re-education. So I'll give you some examples in this talk about pastoralism. Common lands have been privatized and parceled up. And so, a lot of people are not allowed to actually have access to their commons. And borders and leaders have changed, but in the name of sustainable development or climate now, increasingly, people are being dispossessed from their lands, rights, and livelihoods. So, for example, in the name of green energy now, and clean energy, wind and solar also, a lot of local people across India are being denied access to the commons, and in other parts of the world too. So our projects, these two projects, have been concerned with the links between climate change, uncertainty, and transformation. And all of you, if you are scientists, you know that it's very difficult to sometimes capture impacts of climate change. And as you downscale, it's more challenging. At the macro scale, you can capture things better in models, but when you go down, it's really, really difficult. And impacts and knowledges are characterized by uncertainty. But the world still operates around risk, this idea that we can calculate, we can predict, but not really looking at this dimension of uncertainty, which are these unknowns. And the integration in climate change has been very disputed. So in these projects, we've seen that a lot of uncertainty as well as climate is all conceptualized by experts. But what does that mean? How attuned are these with how local people live with and understand uncertainty? And can uncertainty also be a trigger for bottom-up transformation? Now in science, climate science, it's often seen as a monster or a super wicked problem. And despite the limitations of quantitative assessment, which are based on probability, these remain at the heart of how this is captured. So in some way, in other words, we really find some serious gaps in the way in which these issues are conceptualized. And they also ignore place-based experiences, indigenous knowledges and experiences, which rarely find their way in official discourses. And it's really important because these are the most vulnerable, these are the victims of colonial and other processes. So we really have to recognize and deploy diverse knowledges and strategies to actually enable locally just adaptation and mitigation processes. Otherwise, adaptation and mitigation perpetuates the kind of colonial processes that we've seen so far. So, uncertainty is a situation of indeterminacies where we don't know what we don't know, and it has its roots in many disciplines, but usually one distinguishes between the epistemological and the ontological. But generally, the official response has been inadequate, and there's been a tendency to control uncertainty as opposed to living with uncertainty. And of course, now we're in a time of radical uncertainty. We see that across the board. And the repertoires that we have are really, really inadequate. So we came up with a very simplistic heuristic, and of course that you can dig some holes in it, but it did make sense to try and understand these different domains of knowledge around climate change and even the science. So we looked at so-called above, which refers to climate scientists, officials. This is the sort of official knowledge, the expertise. It's more at the longer time frame and more global. And this is the sort of scientific, and it's usually the uncertainty is around the epistemic one. And there are, of course, power and knowledge struggles in whose account matters. And then by contrast, at the other end is the so-called below, which is lay people, which is differentiated by gender, race, ethnicity, class, caste. And these are everyday encounters. And for them, climate change is more about the weather and its changes. It's not so much about long-term climate. And climate change interacts with all kinds of other things that are happening. And these are rarely captured in models. So this is more an experiential and indigenous knowledge. And while people on the ground are accustomed to ecological uncertainty, it's obviously getting these extreme weather events are things that they often can't cope with. And their lay and indigenous knowledge also gets stuck sometimes and can't respond. So I think, and then in the middle, we have probably most people here in this webinar, knowledge brokers, intermediaries, etc., and how they deal with it. So do I have 3 minutes left now, or? So the methodological approach that we worked with, we looked at a range of methods. So ethnographic methods, archival research, visual, GI. So it really was an idea of bringing different knowledge domains and methods together. Because the idea was we had to co-produce knowledge across different disciplines, and also between academics, practitioners, and lay people, because that was the only way in which one could kind of bring about transformative change from below. We worked in the drylands, which is Kutch. We worked in the urban, which is Bombay, Mumbai, and we worked in the Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh. So this is a hotspot, a climate hotspot, and one of the world's largest deltas. We also looked at things historically, and what was really interesting was if you look at even at colonial practices, we had to read the colonial archive against the grain, because these areas like Kutch and the Sundarbans were defined as environmental margins, seen as irregular, extreme weather events, and initiatives by the colonial state tried to normalize these areas, which meant introducing irrigation, reclamation, and all of these really unsuitable to the area. So in some ways, this idea of these environments as marginal, as abnormal, carry on today. And this also molds the way policymakers have reacted. So we did a lot of interviews with climate scientists, and for them, uncertainty was multiple, aleatoric, like in the actual models, this model uncertainty, epistemic uncertainty, and also policy or scenario uncertainty. And there was huge differences in spatial and temporal scales, but the variability and the actual everyday experiences by people in their everyday lives is not adequately captured. So in some ways, you really need to move from this globalizing instinct to a more human-centered climate science. And this has also been captured by people like Heyman, who have looked historically at how climate science moved from something that was more place-based to something that was more at the global and planetary scale, and what was lost as a result of that. So some examples, a lot of them spoke about how difficult it is to capture the monsoon. The temperature is not so difficult, but the monsoon is really, really tricky, and it's not well understood. But still, there's this focus on the models, but it's very important to acknowledge the limits to the models and also their social life and the need for more humility. People like Kristen Hastrup have spoken about the social life of models and the fact that these models are also embedded in culture and practice. And this is not something that one would normally consider. So if we look at one case only, this is the dryland area in Kutch. It was a very so-called remote, backward area when I first went there in the 90s, so-called backward. But now, after a major earthquake, it's been opened up, a lot of industrialization, especially around the coast. All the corporates are there doing all their work, and a lot of local people have been marginalized from access to the coast and the commons. And for them, this is how they see. So they are used to extreme events, but everything seems to be getting far more extreme, as they say, as embodied here in this quote. So we're used to the hot summers and etc. And also droughts are common, but there's really limits to the local knowledge. And also we hear about loss of land, agriculture, fish catch, loss of identity and well-being, not just because of all these impacts, but also indeed because of this aggressive changing political economy. So if I focus, I've got a couple of more slides. If I focus on the pastoralists that I started with, we looked at these very unique swimming camels, the Karai camel that can swim to mangroves and also browse on the land. And a lot of them speak very eloquently about the links between the mangroves, their camels, and their identity and their lives. And they see pastoralism as a form of adaptation and contributing to biodiversity. And they oppose the narrative of camels being harmful to the mangroves. Scientists, by contrast, blame these pastoralists for all the changes in the mangroves, and they don't really look at or implicate industry. So we tried to integrate indigenous knowledge with scientific protocols, with GIS. We also looked at how children represented. And with my colleague from Kyoto University, Nobu Onte, did GIS and mapping, and actually found over time, even areas that were browsed by these camels did not notice any significant change in areas. And in a way, the mangroves were actually sustainable and contributing to biodiversity. But this is not a view that is shared by the scientists of the area, or indeed most scientists. So we've got a lot of work to do to actually publish this firstly. It's very close to publication, and then communicate that more widely. And this is a way in which, even pastoralists can be empowered to insist on their right to graze in the mangroves, and also it validates their lifestyle. So very quickly, I want to also show other things. I've spoken to you about GIS, about historical approaches. Arts approaches also help capture lived experience of vivencia, representing climate change uncertainty. And here we can draw on the voices of women and youth who are not normally the focus, and their voices rarely feed into climate debates, etc. So photo voice also is a way in which you can really capture these hidden stories and make visible the invisible. Children's paintings, this was in the Sundarbans in the height of the pandemic. Children painted how they understand uncertainty, climate change, and also how they want their areas to be transformed. And a lot of these diverse repertoire that we showed can be used in policy for example, in the science policy roundtables, where we try and translate and communicate diverse perceptions of uncertainty and climate change. And really seek out these multiple and hybrid perspectives from different actors, because this is the only way to actually foster transformative and socially just and inclusive trajectories. So in some ways, policymakers and scientists need to enrich their approaches by drawing on local understandings in order to make adaptation and mitigation more attuned to local contexts and realities, and also, be aware of some of the dominant development pathways and challenge them. So to conclude, it's really important to embrace uncertainty in its political nature. Attempts to control or tame it usually falter, and we really need to integrate critical social science perspectives in mainstream climate debates and embrace these hybrid, multiple, and plural ways of knowing. This also means tackling power relations, gender, social, and social difference, and different forms of climate injustice. So how do we decolonize current practices? As I said, it's really important to seek out alternative visions and lift hidden and invisible perspectives, seek out these hybrid and multiple visions, challenge some of these dominant myths. And I gave you the myths of the pastoralists and how they're destroying the environment, challenge dominant indices and tools and methods if they're too reductionist and don't capture the diversity. We have to challenge these invisible white and elite biases, because that's really important. There's this invisibility around these biases, and radically change the way we work and operate. So that means, how do we frame our projects? Can we make sure that funding is more equitable? Can we make sure that the flow of ideas is also more equitable? And also stop perpetuating unequal ways of doing science and doing research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lyla. Thank you for kicking off our panel today with those very important bullet points, especially at the end. I do agree, it's very important to recognize where we have different worldviews, and maybe instead of problematizing multiple perspectives, we actually not just acknowledge, but accept and use them to enhance our decision making. So thank you very much for raising these issues. Let me just check if we have, yes, so we have comments in the chat. Yes, thanking you for this information and this perspective, and for sharing your experiences and knowledge. If there are any burning questions that you really need answered now, I'd be happy to take them. In the meantime, I just want to mention that people have been asking if a recording would be available later on. And the answer is yes. We can send the recording link out later to everyone who registered. So there will, I know these are heavy topics, and I'm sure we'd all want to have the chance to continue to reflect on them even after this panel. Okay, so more comments coming in. Excellent and fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. As there don't seem to be any burning questions now, we will move on to our next speaker, and we'll save that. Oh, sorry, there is one question. I see in the chat, and I see a hand raised. So if you don't mind, Lyla, to take them in the chat, I'll start with that. Can you expound on the colonizing background of sustainability?
Okay, so I think what I was trying to say is that a lot of the colonial science molded sustainability science, which also justified a lot of things that we see today, unequal access to resources, dispossession, and I think other colleagues are going to talk about this. They also shaped and framed areas as marginal, as problematic, as needing intervention. And a lot of the interventions then that, emerge from that have been problematic and have actually increased unsustainability issues. So I can share some links in the chat of publications if you want.
Yes, I think that would be most appreciated.
So
The
others
second,
can carry on with their talks, maybe.
Okay, then
Yeah, and the
Tayaba, are
aspect-
you okay if we come back to you first in the Q&A? I see a hand raised from Tayaba. You may unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is Tayaba. Thank you for first of all for this fascinating presentation. You talked about gender aspect in climate science. Could you possibly talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, sure. So I guess, obviously the impacts of climate are very gendered, and there's been lots and lots of research on that. And it would be wrong to just talk about women only as the victims. They can also be agents, but very often vulnerability is linked with issues of gender and other forms of intersectionality. But also feminist science and feminist epistemology is asking us to question how we even conceptualize science. So, whose knowledge counts? And that's where feminist epistemology and, gender studies really help, because they're asking us to open up the way we view science. We question this idea of objectivity. Sandra Harding, for example, has spoken about standpoint epistemology, which means focusing on the views of the vulnerable first, using that as the starting point to then inform climate science. So I think there's quite a lot in which gender studies and gender are really crucial.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. There's another question in the chat, but I hope it's okay. We'll get to that later during our open forum.
Yeah.
So thank you
I'm
very
sure
much, Lyla.
Yeah, other speakers will also address these issues.
And with that, we move on to our next speaker, Nikki.
Okay, Kendra, let me share my PowerPoint. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So I entitled my presentation or my speech, Nagbabago ang ihip ng hangin, the wind changes direction. Metaphorically, I'm not going to talk about the wind, but I'm going to talk about how my thoughts on colonialism and climate changed as I went through my various stages of education and what I learned from different fields. I'm in interdisciplinary studies, but all my training in various parts of the world are also in different fields. So it's a view from the Philippines and how I acquired my thoughts. If you ask me about this 30 years ago, this will age me, my perspectives on colonialism were shaped by the following. I was a varsity debater in an international circuit. We had world debating championships. I was part of the dinosaur first batch of Filipinos who joined the world debating championships and parliamentary style of debate. And at the time in the 90s, it was just right after the Rio Declaration of 1992. We were debating on sustainable development. GATT in WTO, the World General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was not yet signed at the time. There was a lot of anti-globalization debating. There was the European Union, the post-Cold War order, NATO and the Balkans. Windows 95 was just launched. It was a very exciting time where a vacuum had to be filled politically, and there was also a sense of hope. But at the same time, there was a triumphalism, as if capitalism has won a big war, and there was going to be a whole world that is now going to completely open up, and people were scared also of what the impacts of that would be. At the time, I was taking an undergrad that I continued to an MA in international political economy. And that was where I first learned formally some networks that I continue to hold today, but at some point they stopped being enough. But what shocked me was that, well, I was being conscientized in international political economy about unequal division of labor in the world and an exchange that was very exploitative. I was also learning in international law the possibilities of treaties and what it can do, but the frustration was also strong on what it can't do because it was so soft and implementation was a problem. But I was also in another class where international business and marketing teachers were unapologetic in touting the success stories of case studies of how needs were created where they previously did not exist and markets were penetrated. And it was unproblematized. And then, of course, there were lessons on international development. So I find myself in a marketplace of ideas where I'm totally free to just hear what I want and not say, and not what I don't want, and deny and ignore what I don't want to hear. As a young teacher at the time, I started speaking about dependency theory because I was enamored by it when I learned it. And as I was teaching this class with complete passion, from a very Filipino perspective of how our banana plantations from the American period, or how our mining and all the transnational corporations that have enclave economies that continue to this day, how Starbucks is so expensive, but there are no tropical, there's no coffee being planted in Seattle, all those kinds of commodity chains. I was so happy teaching these things as if I was waking up students. And one senior faculty member who was evaluating my teaching approached me afterwards and said, "Oh my God, you're teaching something so outdated. I feel like I was attending a class in the 70s. And this was, 25 years later. And so I was already beginning to feel, I started to question these things. But dependency theory continued to be the basis for a lot of the debating and a lot of the teaching. And I think that it continues to be the basis for climate justice, are thinking about how the North owes the South an ecological debt. I was also introduced to the book Bananas, Beaches, and Bases by Cynthia Endo. And in that particular book, the Philippines had such a central, it was an example for everything. It was perfect attendance, military bases, nuclear weapons, prostitution outside the bases. Filipino women were there. Export labor, domestic helpers as a part of strategy to pay off debt. Filipinas were the main actresses. Banana plantations, sorting bananas, serving the tourism industry. And so the dependency model became more real to me as I read Cynthia Endo's storytelling of where the women were in that global and world system. And it hit very, very close to home. So even if a teacher was telling me that dependency theory may not be relevant anymore at the time, it was the first way in which I was alerted to a system of unequal exchange as a result of colonialism. And it alerted me that the Philippines was still in a continuing neo-colonial relationship. It made me a bit more critical of what the news would tout as engines of growth. Whenever they would say there are foreign investors that have been attracted, the expansion of our export processing zones, that call centers, the competing with India for services, and all these things that drive growth also continue to retain an exploitative system. I think that dependency theory also, even if it is outdated, was the basis for the idea of ecological debt that continues to be the foundation for an argument for climate justice. It shows how core economies drain ecological capacity from extractive regions like ours by importing resource-intensive products, and shifts the environmental burden to us. By exporting waste. And it alerts us to patterns of unequal exchange even in global climate change. So now I'm going to the change of wind. So this was me, the younger version of me. But then I went to Spain. If you ask me about this 25 years ago, not 30 years ago, my perspectives then on colonialism were shaped by the following things. From the colony, I moved to the heart of the colonizer. And I took my MA in Peace and Development Studies on scholarship from the Spanish government. And I was often asked to give public speeches in small towns where I was asked about the Philippines. But what surprised me while I was in Spain was that my image of an industrialized, wasteful society were challenged by the small towns that I was made to visit in Spain, where the streets were small, where medieval ways of life were preserved, where people closed down, where commerce and capitalism didn't seem to have as much of a hold as I imagined. I couldn't buy anything. There was no 7-Eleven, there was no McDonald's, there was no mall, no 24-hour anything. When I attended a festival there, I got really hungry because everything closed for a religious festivity. And so I began to wonder also about the wastefulness of where I came from. A core in the periphery, which is Metro Manila, which is an air-conditioned, traffic-laden, car-ridden haven of waste. And in my MA, I learned Galton's triangle of violence, and I realized that the dependency theory was about direct violence and structural violence, but my education in cultural violence pushed that a little more into another direction that was very eye-opening, in the direction of the symbolic sphere that makes direct violence and structural violence look and feel right, or at least not wrong. And this structural and cultural violence legitimizes the direct violence. I revisited Galton before this talk, just to remember, how I felt before. And this jumped out to me more today than it did before, about violence against nature. So there's the direct violence of the slashing, the burning, the denuding of the forests. There's also the structural forms of such violence, not intended to destroy nature per se, but nevertheless it does so. The pollution, the depletion associated with modern industry leading to dying forests, the ozone holes, the global warming, and so on. And what happens is transformation of nature through industrial activity, leaving non-degradable residues, depleting non-renewable resources, combined with a world-encompassing commercialization that makes the consequences non-visible to the perpetrators. There are two powerful structures at work, this is Galton speaking, legitimized by economic growth. And the buzzword, sustainable economic growth, may prove to be yet another form of cultural violence. And this is the first time that I started doubting sustainable development as a desirable. And sustainability, anything. I became very suspicious of this. Sorry to my friends in the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. Direct violence to Galton is an event, like an earthquake. Structural violence is a process, like tectonic plates rubbing against each other, if you can use this metaphor. But cultural violence is a kind of permanence. It's a kind of a fault line. And the thought that this provoked in me was the need to deconstruct. Galton alerted us to the binaries as examples of cultural violence that justify certain forms of cultural violence. For example, the binary of human species over animals, plants, and nature leads to speciesism or ecocide. The binary of men and women to sexism and witch burning, and chosen people and others as nationalism and imperialism, whites and colored, and so forth. And I began to learn that there are many internalized binary oppositions that we live with, and we occupy a space. And I had to start deconstructing and asking the question, how did I end up in that space? How did I accept being in that space? Because I'm the woman and the other and the colored on this side. And I started looking not just for the deconstruction, but this is the important thing I learned from my teacher in Spain. What happens after that is try to reconstruct. And in Spanish, the teacher would tell us, recuperar los capaces para hacer las paces, which is recover those capacities for pieces, multiple kinds of peace. So it's not just to deconstruct, not just to question, but also to find a way to return to this dynamic, but to reconstruct and understand what your identity is, whatever has been suppressed, and to take ownership. And so suddenly dependency theory was not enough anymore. I was happy to learn about the violence, but I now had a new project in mind. So coming from Spain, the wind would change again. There were two things that happened to me, what I learned in school, but also that people kept asking me how Filipinos think, and I didn't know how to answer because I never studied how Filipinos think. And I lived in Manila. I am so bereft of any personal knowledge and experience of the natural environment. I lived in a condo in a building in Makati, which is full of buildings. And I started feeling a kind of longing for a knowledge I did not possess. and also a new dream. Something in Spain instilled in me a new kind of dream that went beyond the dependency theory model and went beyond the binary. In the end of Galto's article, he goes to Gandhi and he asks, so how do we address all this violence? How do we move forward? How do we get out of this? And Gandhi offers two actions operating on a logic of closeness, not separation. It's the unity of life and the unity of means and ends. Unity of life is to recover the respect for the sacredness of all life, enhancing all life and not just human life. And the unity of means and ends is a call for synchrony, calling for working on all issues simultaneously. And that the way to address a triangle of violence is not to separate them and to say, let's do the direct violence first, or let's do the structural or the cultural first, but to address the triangle all at once and together. And so I left Spain and before I leaving Spain, I also met in my course Vandana Shiva, and when I was looking for that kind of unity, I saw in this scientist, a physicist, talking about the recovery of the sacred, someone who saw and spoke to me. It spoke to my heart, and so I was thinking, both Gandhi and Vandana Shiva drew on the resources of the culture that they took root in. I mean, both were trained in the West, but both embraced what Indian culture had to offer. And of course, I don't have Indian culture. What I have is Filipino culture. And so if you ask me about this 15 years ago, my perspectives on colonialism were shaped by a PhD that brought me back home, this time in Southeast Asian studies. I work with Reynaldo Oleto, a historian and a post-colonial scholar who championed the history from below. And I wrote my dissertation on a Filipino topic, a colonial art form that continues to this day. But while doing that, of course, Singapore funded the trips to do field work and to do research conferences. But I was living in the island city of Singapore for 5 years. I discovered in Southeast Asia and the Philippines a very rich spiritual landscape in a very urbanized and modern setting. But I was also living in a utopic city that seemed to check all the SDG development goals. That's what Singapore looked like to me. They had clean water, they had eradicated poverty. At the same time, the haze would come in and then shatter the illusion that Singapore was completely in control. So these were the thoughts that I was having 15 years ago. So my mentor, sorry, Kendra, it's time.
We can finish up maybe 3 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So my mentor, Reynaldo Oleto, opened my mind to another possibility of how to view colonialism. He said that Christianity that was given to us supposedly or imposed on us by the Spanish, we only had a partial allegiance to it and a shifting accommodation of it, because we had our own way of doing Christianity that was not the same way as the original, and that this became a tool and a resource, not just the Enlightenment from Europe, the way national heroes are painted to be the ones that woke us up, but there was something in what we became during our experience as a colony that was built on the workings of our own minds. So there was a sense of agency, and he challenged me to find out the workings of the Filipino mind. So I started working in communities, in rural areas, in fiestas and festivals, where people handed down through generations the continuous performance of colonial era theater, dance, song, a combination of performances. And I soon found out that people were doing this for 7 days, 9 days, in an ethic of sacrifice under the heat of the sun for many lengthy hours, in the belief that it is efficacious. They believe that doing so matters, that doing so is an offering, a sacred vow. If they want a good harvest, if they want good weather, if they want to be saved from extreme climate, then they continue to offer through dance and song these devotional performances. So now, if you ask me today, I'm in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies in Ateneo. I'm in the Laudato Si working group in Ateneo. I was a convener of a 1-month-long conference on contacts and continuities, 500 years of Asian-Iberian relations that traced a dialogical how an exchange of knowledge between Asia and Europe took place in the last 500 years. That was the theme of our conference. Now, also, I'm a teacher of nonviolence, and I continue to try to see how can I view climate outside just the binaries without ignoring them. So the book, I've been sharing books that, Vandana Shiva, Galtung, and Cynthia Enlow. But the book that is shaping me the most now is Laudato Si. It's not even a book, it's the encyclical of the Pope. Here is a piece of writing from what was a center of power. And I remember when I visited Rome, I found it very patriarchal, very masculine, very imperial in its design and in its architecture. But this document, when I read it, I felt it had a tone of atonement, as if the church is acknowledging what it had ignored or even suppressed. It had a different view of indigenous faith and indigenous peoples and their knowledge. And it spoke as a way of acting to bridge cultural divides. It seemed to me like an atonement, a call for solidarity, an open invitation to everyone wherever they are in their journey towards an ecological conversion. And it calls for a restoration of a sense of awe and wonder and a recovery of the sacred, whatever your religion is. Can I have a last slide, if it's okay? So I've been thinking about how I feel that there is space where I locate Laudato Si in beliefs. There are many people, I feel the worst, who are responsible for degradation and greed are those who are in the lowest left corner quadrant, those who do not believe in the climate science, do not believe that the global warming is happening, and also do not believe in anything that is sacred. And these are the people who are most likely to just denude an entire mountain in the service of economic growth or economic activity. But there are those who believe in the science, who have no allegiance or don't believe necessarily in the sacred, but believe that global warming is happening and that humans must do something. I have a student who looked at this quadrant, and she found that a lot of the young environmental activists were breaking down because of hopelessness, and they were losing they were feeling very depressed that nothing can be done. And so I feel that the quadrant that we want to be in is this quadrant of hope. This, I feel, is where Laudato Si is. A quadrant where, and the Laudato Si document, has the science, and the Jesuits in the history of Philippine evangelization were the ones who brought us science. Same people who brought the science also brought the faith. And this combination, I feel, is the one that activates the most human capacity, because we need everything in order to address a problem so big. We need our interior resources, and that's engaged in this quadrant. And there are a lot of Filipinos who are very much into sacred and into faith, whether official religion or folk beliefs, who don't believe the science. And we call this resilience. So that when the storms happen, when something bad really happens, they turn to prayer, and this keeps them strong. But there is no desire for a systemic change, and there is no response that will allow a concerted action and a solid response to the environmental problem on a global scale. So for a final parting shot, now that I'm in Ateneo working with the Laudato Si group, working with different colleges in the schools that have different kinds of knowledge and agendas, I feel a tension between an environmentalism that accommodates business interests and an environmentalism that sacralizes or emphasizes a recovery of a bond between humanity and nature that is beyond the material. And I feel that the SDG goals there is a tension between SDG goals, which are practical, actionable, measurable, and accommodating of what we currently have in place, and a call for a more radical change, a departure from that, a simpler lifestyle, and a true ecological conversion. And that these are the tensions that we will continue to be navigating. So sorry, Kendra, I think this is where I'll stop.
No problem. Thank you so much, Nikki. Actually, because of your talk now, I'm more interested to learn more about cultural violence and to deconstruct the notion of sustainability, given that here I am with the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and perhaps we may need to question where we're coming from also. So thank you for that eye-opener. We do have a quick question in our chat. What would our global and or indigenous alternative to the what would our global or indigenous alternative be to the concept of sustainability?
From Gandhi's, but of course this was within his time, no? But from Gandhi's prescription is the village as the social arrangement that allows for bonds of closeness because the city is too big. The city is too big. And so, and the response to that would be, it has to be a diversity of responses that are very local. And so there is no single answer to what the indigenous responses would be other than to emphasize its plural form and to say that very local village level types of responses is one of the prescriptions that I've read, because I'm also wondering how, now what do we do? So solidarity is about us communicating and sharing the knowledges that we have, that there are many things coastal people from across the world can share with one another. But there would always be differences because the geologic formation would be different and yeah. So the answer is in a plurality of smaller scale responses communicated through a network of solidarity across different areas of the South, just to learn about each other's experiences and be inspired by them. But then to proceed also from the village level, if it's the indigenous peoples we're talking about.
Yes. Thank you. Are you okay to take one more quick question? This is about the tension between science and the sacred and how we reconcile it when the belief that there are certain gods and goddesses inhabit nature who have to be accepted. So somehow people have to respect and safeguard nature. When science thinks more, sorry, I don't know if this was cut off, something about science and exploitation, but I think the question's mainly about the tension between science and the sacred.
Okay, so I have this feeling that it's really not an either or, that there are really people who can understand, access, and use the science, but at the same time, they are also people who believe in the spirits. Mankind has come up with 4 ways of explaining what he sees. He can explain it through science, explain it through myth, explain it through philosophy, or explain it through religion. But what I learned from my very postmodern education after and during my PhD is that the mind is able to have many allegiances. It has the power to have multiple allegiances and shifting identities or coexisting identities. So I would probably use a metaphor from the colonial era of the boat, the galleon ship. In it were the military, the seafarer as scientist who studies navigation, but also he was the evangelist who was out there motivated by a mission to convert. But that same person was the ethnographer and the biographer and writing what they ate, and became the first people to do an exchange of plants and food. They were the botanists. They were everything in that boat. And at the same time, the people who were building that boat knew what kind of wood did well in water because they knew their wood. So the locals, they found expression, and this is not to romanticize the relationship. Of course, there was a lot of violence, but there was how we came to be where we are in terms of what we know was also a product of a lot of confluence of knowledges and beliefs. And that same boat would pass through the Lady of Antipolo, La Naval, praying that they will return. And when they return, they're all very grateful, whatever their fates are. So I don't know. I don't want to answer in terms of binaries.
Yes. And there is a comment on that in the chat, maybe to complement your answer, saying that maybe we can move away from pendulum thinking and welcome spectrum thinking.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Nikki. There is another question for you, but if it's okay, we will take that up during the Q&A session. So with that, we will move on to our last talk of this evening, which I think will be done jointly, if I'm not mistaken, between Harriet and Tom. You have the floor.
That's great. Can everyone hear me and see the slide? Fantastic. Okay. So yeah, as you've just said, we're going to be passing back and forth between myself and Harriet. Huge thanks to, everyone involved in setting this up, particularly Vandana, who got in touch with us. And thanks to our co-panelists for two fantastic papers, which I think actually, relate, I hope, really well to our own. And I hope that we do it justice. So I'm going to open, but the instruction from Vandana was to try to open with some words in a language other than English. I have signally failed to do so, which is partly to do with me being, substantially monolingual. But actually, what I want to try to show is that this quotation, although it's on the slide in English, is absolutely not a straightforward example of the kind of dominance of English language and kind of Anglophone ways of thinking in sciences of climate and environment. So the quote's as follows, and I'm sure many of you can read it, but I'll just go over it. Large blocks of ice, some of a spiral form, were lying about the station. Perhaps the place derives its name from this, cam, a spire or curl. They say that this ice shifts, for the people of the country observe that a particular stone which at one season is on the side is after some time observable at the summit of the mountain. Moreover, the water which bubbles at the lower part, having become ice, pushes up and takes the place of the ice above it. So these words were translations into English of a Persian language journal kept by Mir Izzet Ullah, an elite Munshi or Muslim scribe, during his journey to the northwestern Himalaya, beyond the frontier of British colonial India at the time, in 1812. They typify the complicated forms of transmission and translation that mark out so many instances of imperial climate knowledge making. And it's these instances that Harriet and I are both very interested in as historians of climate sciences and historians of empire. So Ullah went to the region at the behest of a British trader, diplomat and spy named William Moorcroft, who was involved in the colonial state. And the people of the country that Ullah mentions as his informants were members of a Himalayan community, the Baltis, who had sufficiently long-term experience of these and report on changes on the timescale of seasons, years, and even decades. Ullah's words were translated into English by a British Orientalist scholar and administrator, Horace Wilson, and published first in a Calcutta-based periodical in 1825. And then some 18 years later, 1843, they were republished in an updated form in London in the highly prestigious Journal of the Asiatic Society, or Royal Asiatic Society. So this very complicated chain of transmission. And it didn't stop there. Ullah was later cited in many works by colonial administrators, scholars, and travellers who, as the 19th century progressed, increasingly saw the distributions and movements of ice in the Himalaya as markers of climate as a thing that could change over relatively short timescales. So while Ullah's claim of ice and stones travelling uphill were often derided in these later works and probably remain quite perplexing to us today, the representations of some of these later scholars, including this 1863 watercolour sketch in the top left of this slide, which was by a colonial surveyor, Henry Godwin Austen, have become embedded as benchmarks for present-day glacier-based climatology. So it's put to use, for instance, in this recent article by Daniel Farinotti and his colleagues on glacier changes in high mountain Asia, and put to work in evidencing the so-called Karakoram anomaly, a supposed climatic anomaly to the sort of northwest of the Greater Himalaya region. So that's the quotation we're opening with and my gloss on it. I'm now going to hand over to Harriet to explain sort of what this might tell us in more general terms.
Yes, and I'm afraid that Marta has woken up right on cue, so she's going to help me with the presentation. Now, Tom and I, we want to stay now for a moment in this very recent past and think about how last year, so in 2022, the IPCC published its 6th annual report, and that report made news headlines around the world, not only for what it said about the dire state of the climate system, but also for what it said about colonialism and the connections between these two things. So the report made clear statements, like the one that you can see on our slide, that historic and ongoing processes of colonialism have exacerbated the impacts of climate change on already vulnerable communities. And as you can see, the report said that it was with high confidence that colonialism contributed to the uneven impacts of climate change on ecosystems and people. But this focus on colonialism was specific to just one part of the IPCC's report, and it was contained in Working Group 2, which is the report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. In the other 2 working group reports, colonialism didn't receive anything like the same attention. And this silence was something that Tom and I thought was significant, especially in the Working Group 1 report on the physical science basis of climate change. Because as Tom said, we studied the history of climate science, and we've seen how it is a field that has been profoundly influenced by imperialism and colonialism. So when we saw this graphical representation from the latest IPCC assessment report, it's a representation of the history of the key ideas in the development of climate science, we could at once, of course, appreciate the need for a clear and a concise overview of climate science history, but we could also see what was missing from this graph. So this graph represents what Tom and I have called the biographical history of climate science, and it highlights the work of a few seminal thinkers who developed very key ideas and theories about the composition of the atmosphere and the effects that humans have had on that composition. What the graph doesn't highlight is the imperial and colonial context in which most of these thinkers worked. And what it certainly doesn't highlight is the indigenous and local voices like that of Allah, who Tom started our presentation with. So Tom and I thought it would be helpful for both historians like ourselves and scientists to have an overview of the latest historical research on the connections between climate science and colonialism. And this is what we did for Wire's Climate Change Journal. We reviewed histories that came out in the last 5 years. And when we did that, we found that 5 key themes emerged from these studies. So the first of these was the often overlooked contribution of Indigenous knowledge and labor to the development of climate science. And a good example of this comes from the work of Philip Lehman, who's a historian of German colonialism in Africa. Now, Lehman has shown that the 19th century German scientist and explorer Heinrich Barth relied on Indigenous local North African guides to help him find and interpret a series of rock engravings in the Libyan desert. And these engravings, which are the ones you can see on the slide, then went on to become a critical piece of evidence in 19th century debates about whether climate was something that could change over time and just how much it could change. So the engravings seem to suggest that the region had undergone dramatic climatic change because they were found in a very arid site, but they depicted animals that relied on regular rainfall for their survival. Now, this same research, Lehman's research, also offers a good example, we think, of our second key theme that emerged from our review, which is that even though Indigenous and local people's knowledge was highly sought after, it was often also devalued and at times erased from the historical record. So Lehman has shown that one of the reasons that European scientists started to increasingly deride Indigenous people's knowledge in North Africa from the late 19th century was in fact because of their own insecurities about their research. So when some European scientists couldn't find the kind of data that they were hoping to uncover, they blamed their local informants for their inability to keep that kind of data, that quantifiable kind of data. And even as they did that, at the same time, they relied on them to help them locate different types of evidence of past climatic change. So we see this tension there. So I think it's important to point out that these were not isolated incidents. They occurred in multiple imperial contexts. And Tom has in fact shown in his research, for example, just how reliant British scientists were on local guides to help them locate and make sense of evidence of past climatic change. And so the example he started with is an excellent one. These guides help scientists like Henry Goodwin Austen understand changes to glaciers over time and how these might relate to past periods of climatic change. Even though, as you just heard, Austen's work is still used by climate scientists today, the guides that assisted him are very rarely, if ever, mentioned.
All right, so back to me for a brief moment, and I'll try to kind of skip through this relatively quickly. The third key theme that we highlight in the article is that 19th and 20th century empires in particular were utterly crucial to constructing the infrastructures of observation and measurement that continue to shape how scientists comprehend and calculate climate change. These infrastructures were shaped by imperial goals during an era of unprecedented expansion of European and Euro-American power across the globe. Goals including control over people and territory, resource extraction, and profit-making. But just because the history of climate sciences cannot be told without the history of imperialism, it does not follow that imperial climate data and theories were uniform or simple. And historian of science Deborah Cohen, who's a really major figure in our field, captures this kind of duality, I think, really well in her recent claims that, on the one hand, quote, climate science grew out of the political context of 19th century empire building, but then also, on the other hand, that, quote, climate science was constructed out of a panoply of different ways of knowing. Let's just think about three brief, concrete examples of how, in fact, I'm going to choose two. We'll have two concrete examples of how this kind of backdrop shaped the sorts of instrumental records that scientists today have available to them. First, and really simply, if you take a look at the world map, top right of this slide, which displays the distribution of meteorological stations in 1899, you probably don't need to be a historian of empire to spot that this isn't kind of that far off of being identical to a map from around the same time, which might show established regions of European and Western domination, right? So the kind of blank areas on the map are generally those that either are not or are no longer parts of the kind of Euro-Western dominated world. Obviously, I think it's really notable to say, going all the way back to the introduction to this session, how different this map is from the geography of the My Climate Risk hubs, right, which are absolutely distributed throughout multiple centres in the global south. This is not, to say the least. A second example, I think, also relates to this fourth major theme of our article, and that is that empires that ruled over large contiguous land masses made particularly deep and often theoretically and materially really innovative investments in climatic and meteorological research. So as part of the project that Harriet and I are on at the University of Cambridge, I've had the real pleasure of conducting oral history interviews with some climate scientists who are engaged in global temperature measurement, constructing global temperature series, really back in the 1970s and 1980s, quite pioneering work back then. And one of my interviewees was Phil Jones, who may well be known to many of you, particularly from a climate science background, a leading figure behind the global temperature data set that was compiled and is now maintained by a team at the Climatic Research Unit in the University of East Anglia. And in our interview, Phil told me that a really crucial breakthrough in his work during the early to mid-80s was coming across a stock of sources that, although published, were very little distributed, that had been produced in the Russian Empire back in the 19th century. And it was these sources that allowed him and his team at the Climatic Research Unit to fill in the Northern Hemisphere, or at least the landmass of the Northern Hemisphere, with the Russian Empire obviously occupying a huge portion of that, to an extent that was sufficient to generate what they considered to be a global instrumental record, which stretched all the way back to 1850, rather than, as was otherwise the case, starting in 1880. So the current kind of authoritative temporal definition of what the pre-industrial global temperature was, which is clearly a kind of key metric of anthropogenic climate change, says that it's the period from 1850 to 1900. It's a mean of that period. And this definition is entirely dependent on these imperial Russian meteorological and climatological works, which were created in the service of comprehending climatic variations across this enormous Eurasian land empire. The map in the bottom corner is one example of such kind of late 19th century Russian climatology. And now the final major theme, before we pass on, I'm really going to skip over this because I think it's something that, you know, actually has come up in the other papers as well, and we'll skip to a bit more in our concluding remarks. Basically, in the article, we seek to show that imperial ways of doing climate science, especially the ways in which whose knowledge and methods count and whose don't, persist well after what is often, although I'm sure not among the people in this audience, often thought of as the end of the age of empire, the end of colonialism in the mid-20th century. As we've heard in the wonderful papers earlier, that, you know, straightforwardly is not the case. So an example of this is the kind of, the patterns and the kind of voices that are heard and those that are not extend well beyond regions of formal empire. This, for instance, remained the case in Greenland during US missions there to take ice cores into the mid-19th century. It also very much sort of shapes when different places come into the instrumental record, the instrumental data set, as in the case of the Tokyo Meteorological Observatory in the late 19th century, which relied on the arrival of American and British equipment technology, instrumental technologies like the Stevenson screens depicted in this image below right, in order to kind of make it into global data sets that are now used today. So I suppose it's at this point that we kind of hand over from a historical focus and it kind of blends in to this wonderful burgeoning set of studies looking at how Indigenous knowledge and climate relates in the present and relate in the future. I'll hand back over to Harriet now to say a little more on some of the sort of bigger stakes of our project.
Yeah, so Tom and I wanted to finish off by talking a little bit about some of these lasting legacies that we've mentioned. And so we started this short presentation of ours by thinking about how really powerful institutions like the IPCC have been more inclined to consider issues of colonialism when it concerns the impacts of climate change on vulnerable peoples. And this is, of course, a really important first step. But it's also one that we think comes with some risks. And one of them is that by including colonialism in the vulnerability part of the IPCC's report and leaving it out of the physical science part, knowledge can be seen as something that is made about Indigenous or colonized peoples rather than by them. And the other problem is that overlooking the past impact of colonialism on the science of climate change risks missing the ongoing effects of that historic relationship. And so this is something that Tom and I are planning to investigate further, but we'll just mention a couple of examples. So one of these potential legacies is the uneven distribution of proxy records and record analysis across the world. So in this image that you see on the slide, you can see the spatial distribution of the Pages 2K database that underpins many global temperature reconstructions. And what probably stands out almost immediately is how much of this data is clustered in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, of course, one reason for this is because a major proxy source is tree rings, and trees grow on land, and there is a lot more land in the Northern Hemisphere. But we also think that this Northern Hemisphere bias in the global temperature record is symptomatic of a climate science that has historically been focused around the research priorities of colonial powers based in the global North. So in other words, we think that there are both biophysical and socio-political reasons that we get this clustering, this northern clustering of records. Another legacy that we're also interested in investigating further is this common division of proxy evidence into categories of the archives of nature versus the archives of society. So this division typically means that the types of evidence you see on the screen here, like trees and coral cores, they get characterized as part of the archives of nature, while sources like weather diaries and ship log books that have been penned by human hands get filed under the archives of society. And this way of sorting evidence into one of two categories, we believe, is another remnant of colonialism, and it can make it challenging for contemporary Indigenous climate knowledge holders to engage with a climate science that's still based on this quite strict distinction between nature and culture, and it's a distinction which they themselves might not necessarily recognize or endorse. So I'll hand back over to Tom.
Right. So just a very, very brief attempt to finish up. And I think in some ways, following on from Nikki's paper is a really wonderful kind of position to be in here, because one of the things that really stood out, Nikki, was I think your amazing kind of description of what it might mean to not just to deconstruct with the kind of work that we do. And I think in some ways, really what Harriet and I are trying to do is our own version of that. That's specific to being a historian of to being historians of science and environmental historians. So what we're trying to work out, I guess, is how doing good histories of climate science in the kind of traditional academic sense, which basically means, accurately reading source material, having, extensive coverage of a given topic, can allow us to do good with those histories of climate science. So that is contributing to projects of ethical and political value. And this really isn't a given, because much of what counts as doing good history of science in that kind of scholarly sense over the past 50 years or so has promoted the idea that the primary value of historical inquiry into sciences is basically to kind of cut scientific truth claims and methodologies down to size, and instead to demonstrate how contingent and particular they are, whose purposes they serve. And basically say these kind of ostensibly universal knowledge claims really aren't universal at all. They're very particular. And clearly, making that kind of argument in an age of climate emergency and associated post-truth politics kind of risks mimicking, or at least failing to oppose, some really politically and ethically dubious values. So instead of this kind of skeptical, suspicious approach to history, I think Harriet and I, a bit like you were saying, Nikki, kind of want to outline what I suppose I would think of as a kind of proactive relationship between historians of climate science and climate scientists, which is one marked, not only by mutual challenge, but also by mutual learning. Obviously, hopefully we'll hear a bit more about this in the Q&A, including the challenges, by the way, to us. Just a couple of things, though, that I will end with, which are very brief, I promise, that I think sort of climate scientists might want to learn from our kind of history. The first is that understanding the colonial imperial legacies that inhere in climate science, it doesn't just stop there, right? It doesn't just stop with kind of, oh, it's imperial and colonial, what can we do about that? It should be, I think, a real precursor and a prompt to sustained efforts to take account of these and either to try to correct or to mitigate them, and to change where possible. Second, I think telling histories of climate science that feature actors beyond this very biographical, narrow cast of kind of lone white geniuses, all of whom almost always are men, reminds us that scientific knowledge of climate long has been pluralistic. And it, still, of course, can be and must be. It can have many sources and multiple audiences. It can be locally and regionally adaptable, just in keeping with, I think, My Climate Risks kind of way of doing things. And I suppose, finally, more diversely populated histories of climate science, we hope, will serve as a kind of a minor form, at least, of inspiration for a more inclusive scientific field today and in the future. So yeah, with those thoughts, we'd love to hear everyone's comments. Sorry for going over time by so much, but thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. It's really a fascinating story to try to view the history of climate science through the lens of imperialism. That's something new for me also. And I'm hearing some of the same, enrichment of the themes that we've had with our previous speakers also, about the pluralism and the tensions between the local and the contingent, and the global and the universal, and maybe rethinking the legacies that we're leaving for the future. There's a request in the chat if you would kindly share some of your papers, and Vandana has obliged with one of them already. Thank you. And a quick question on: would you agree that helicopter researchers from the West continue to do the same thing in the study of ecosystems in the global South?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Harry, do you want to have a go at answering that?
I think the short answer is to some extent yes. And I have talked to some climate scientists about this who are hopeful about changing these practices, and we've talked about how, in fact, the very language of climate science, some of the vocabulary of using words like extracting a core is also remnant of a colonial era, and of extracting other kinds of resources from places like Australia, where I come from, that are former British colonies with ongoing colonial, politics. So yes, I do think so, and I think that at least some of the scientists I've talked to are becoming much more aware of flying in, for example, from a place like London into Australia, potentially extracting a sediment core from Indigenous people's land, taking that core back to their lab to analyzing it, and missing a lot of local context in that process. But I think it's also something that is becoming, I think there's a lot more awareness being raised about these kind of practices.
I think just one thing I'd just add to that really quickly, very much, I mean, this is like in no way my research whatsoever, but learning from colleagues, particularly at the Scott Polar Research Institute, which is based in Cambridge. I think there's some really interesting discussions, which obviously have very particular specificities, because it's not an area where there's Indigenous human populations, around kind of the ethics of travel for research to Antarctica. And it seems like there's a really kind of interesting, again, burgeoning kind of subfield of, critical papers that are kind of saying, actually, like, we need not to always think that the primary way of conducting environmental sciences involves on the spot visits, making kind of active use of remote sensing technologies and remaining with those can sometimes, for certain purposes, be sufficient. So I think trying to do away with, again, a set of values that very much, was born of the colonial era, which involves particularly men going to distant places and that kind of accrediting certain forms of knowledge. So yeah, I think there's some really interesting work out there that addresses what is a fascinating question to raise. So thanks for that.
I think that's something that we're also grappling with, even in the Philippines, and we're considered the global South. But even within our communities, there's distinction, and we do have that challenge also of scientists going into communities and ecosystems and after the grant is over, what happens next? The papers are published, but then the challenge is always how have we actually uplifted or made any impact in those areas if we just fly in and out? So it is something that we're also grappling with, even how we do science in the global south. And perhaps that's also tied to our history of colonialism as well. At this point, I'd like to thank Tom and Harriet for their presentation. And at this point, I'd like to invite all the panelists to turn on their cameras and all the audience as well, because we would like to take a group photo before we move into the question and answer, because I have a feeling that the question and answer will be very engaging and we might forget to do the group photo later. So I'm going to ask everyone, please, if you can, if your bandwidth allows, please do turn on your cameras. Jean will signal us regarding the group photo. I think we will need at least 2 pages.
Yeah. All right. So everyone, please hold your smiles in 3. First panel, 3, 2, 1. All right. Next panel. Lovely smiles. Thank you very much. 3, 2, 1. All right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jean. And thank you, everyone, for showing your beautiful smiles. So I will invite our panelists to stay on stage and spotlighted with the cameras on so we can proceed to our question and answer. And already we do have some questions lined up. I will start with the ones that came in for Lyla earlier this evening. Could you please explain how adaptive measures could reproduce colonial power structures?
Okay, I think both adaptation and mitigation can do that. So I guess often they need to be locally appropriate, and often they're not. There's sometimes, there's a climate action plan somewhere at the national or global level, and then they just cut and paste for different areas. And the 3 areas I've shown are so diverse. As Tom was also saying, this tension between a globalized solution and something that is locally appropriate. And in the name of adaptation, you can ask people to move out of so-called vulnerable areas. In the name of adaptation and mitigation, you can introduce projects that reinforce very unjust and colonial structures. So that's just an example. And mostly these are, so they really need to be locally owned and locally appropriate. And that is often not the case.
Mm. Would any one of our other speakers want to chime in on that? Yes, Tom, I see you.
I think, yeah, I mean, I certainly don't have anywhere near Lyla's expertise. I suppose just at a sort of more anecdotal level, I think something that, sort of struck me from, so I've spent periods particularly in Delhi and also in Assam in northeast India on our archival research rather than, so this isn't based on kind of ethnographic field work. But the kind of narratives of climate change in those regions, overwhelmingly, it seemed to me, tend to identify the kind of public-facing popular narratives, all too often identify kind of groups that were, disempowered and kind of defined by colonial ethnography as relatively disempowered groups as the kind of prime culprits of climate change in a way that allows those who, I think it's fair to say, probably are the prime culprits of climate change in terms of the more kind of affluent and, carbon combusting sections of society to sort of get away with it. So yeah, I suppose that it always struck me in that sort of anecdotal sense was, quite a major feature of the sort of climate discourses in the present in those regions.
I think this question might also be relevant for some of the things that Nikki had talked about, because I remember what you said about Laudato Si, and I know that part of that was the Pope criticizing how we appeal to technology maybe as a solution, an adaptation solution, and that how maybe in some sense might be related to some colonial legacy.
Yeah, I think that the dream of development and progress needs to be problematized at some point. Because in our call for equality, we are saying, give us what you access to. Give us the spoils that you have enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
And this timeline needs to be disturbed. And by timeline, I mean, it is as if there's a linear vision of progress and we're just a bit behind. That's what the word developing implies, that at some point we will be developed too. But going in the same trajectory in the name of justice is also problematic because the planetary boundaries have already been breached. So what we need to recover is a dream of our own vision. And I think the pandemic woke up some of our impulses that modern society had silenced. People relearned what their grandmothers knew, which is to plant and eat what they planted. I'm only separated by a generation with my grandmother, but her lifestyle compared to mine and the knowledge she had and the lack of knowledge I have on how to feed myself. It's so, but because I have a PhD, I am the one who sort of learned more. But my grandmother, if there was a typhoon that cut off all road access, could probably feed the whole town because she could. She had chicken and she had stuff. And to me, that is a kind of, there is a kind of loss that is unforgivable, that we started during the pandemic to revisit what is important. And now that we're back on site, we've forgotten again what we were beginning to remember. People were already posting on social media all the things they were planting. In Ateneo, where the urban, the campus master plan used to prevent people from planting for sustenance because there is a plan. But of course, there are guerrilla people who really plant. Suddenly the Jesuits planted already, and we remembered that we have the impulse to plant and the capacity to plant vegetables, and that became a very public thing. Now it's gone again. So I guess that's it's really a call for a shifting. So some of the science supports, that's what I mean. Some of the science supports the sustenance, and that's where sustainability is a problem sometimes. It sustains something that is problematic.
And speaking of loss, I think this next question is related to that. And it's, well, these are actually two questions that I'm going to combine in one, as I think these are maybe two sides of the same coin, and it is relevant to all your presentations. On the one hand, what are your thoughts on empowering and supporting Indigenous practices and responses, especially as they've been marginalized over time? And on the other hand, what do you say about ecology and all the disciplines as science of the empire? So on the one hand, thinking about empowering and supporting Indigenous practices, responses, and knowledge that have been marginalized over time. But then on the other hand, maybe rethinking how do we then regard ecology and other disciplines that are sciences of the empire. Lyla, would you like to start?
Okay, yeah, two very good questions. Well, I think we should not be empowering anybody, for one. I mean, who is we? And you know, who needs empowering? I think, in a way, yes. I think that we need to embrace, as experts and a range of experts, whoever we are, to embrace humility, learning, and it's about learning together and doing together. So obviously, you know, there is a certain power that scientists have, or academics have, or researchers have, in validating knowledge. So that, yes, in that sense, I would say, you know, lift the knowledge of Indigenous people, do it respectfully. It has to be done in a way that is appropriate and doesn't reintroduce some form of appropriation, because in the name of empowerment, all kinds of things can happen. Also, knowledge can be appropriated, and we don't want that. So I think it's about doing it together, learning together, and some of the very interesting research in the Arctic, in the Andes, etc., has been done when climate scientists, when social scientists, when local communities, when Indigenous people come together and try and create something new. And this is also a slight response to this idea of the helicopter knowledge or helicopter scientists coming in. Obviously, that is completely wrong. But if you build on long durée engagement, where you've been working for a long time in a particular place, and you're working with local partners and with local communities, that's the way to do it. So it doesn't matter whether you come or not, because that work is happening anyway. And sometimes one might have to facilitate some funding being in the global north. But I think it's all about resetting and changing the way we work with Indigenous communities or local communities. And so, yes, ecology is a science. So I think, as we've heard from other speakers here, we have to acknowledge the colonial and the problematic biases and the roots. And how do we reshift that? We reshift that also through a process of learning, unlearning, and co-producing. So the best knowledge is that kind of hybrid knowledge. And I think, we already heard about how the IPCC really problematically separates out working group 1, 2, 3. That is really problematic. All these knowledges have to come together and also acknowledge not just the colonial roots, but also how these different disciplines have to come together and work together. So in that sense, ecologists should be working with historians, with social scientists, with local people to really reshape things, because that's the future. We have wicked problems, we have complex problems, and we need these complex ways of doing things to solve them.
We need more systems perspectives then.
Well, systems, yes, but systems is also static, right? A systems perspective may not look at power, politics, intersectionality. It's all about also maintaining a system. So I think we have to go even beyond that kind of systems perspective.
Oh, thank you. That's a very good point. And yes, that comment on the term empowering is also echoed in our chat, who empowers whom. So I'm realizing now even in our language, the way we state things, we need to maybe be more sensitive and to recognize where those myths and assumptions about where the power is and how it should be shifted is sort of even ingrained in how we state, in language and how we state these things. Vandana, you had a question for Harriet and Tom?
I do, but I think there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that come before. Should we tackle those first?
Okay, then we move to a question. This was also for Lyla on how in some indigenous and tribal cultures, women are not allowed to assume leadership positions formally. How could we enhance their roles and on climate change, I think, and respect the culture at the same time?
Sorry, because I dropped out. I've missed some of these questions. Yes, so I heard that. So I think very briefly, we've spoken a lot about focusing on indigenous culture, but also let's be aware, let's not be too romantic about the indigenous. And so we have to be aware of cleavages within all these societies, so patriarchal or other forms of exclusion. And it's similar to what we've discussed here on this panel. We're interested in making sure that silenced voices are lifted everywhere. And if it's in indigenous communities, that's where it needs to go too. So how do you work with groups that are silenced within these communities? And, really moving away from taking a homogenous view of community too, and, not just being too overly romantic about what's happening. Just because it's indigenous doesn't mean everything is funky.
Yes, that's true. Thank you. Yes, Nikki, you have a rejoinder to that?
No, I was just going to draw from conflict resolution studies where Lederach has this framework. John Paul Lederach has a framework for integrating prescriptive and elicitive approaches when you're communicating with the community. I remember in service learning, whenever my students are going to a community, the communities sometimes that they talk to look for something. And if it's always their views that are being elicited, their stories that's being documented, some of them felt that they didn't get because students didn't wanted to provide space and to capture narratives. But some of the participants wanted something new. So they wanted the students to bring something to the table and not just always from them. So I remember this model in peace studies where an integration of prescriptive and elicitive approaches and a balance of both offers the space for dialogue between the outsider and the community. It's a very difficult balance to know what the prescriptions are, because it's always awkward to go somewhere with a prescription. But sometimes communities are also hungry for benefits of dialogue, and they are expecting something. So I don't know if that's related.
It's a good point. Thank you. And Tom?
Yeah, I think that this is probably a slightly silly attempt on my part to sort of kind of draw together some of the questions and then some of the responses that we've heard into something coherent. I guess coming back to this point of empowerment and sort of what actually might that mean, who is empowering whom, what position of power do we in kind of higher education institutions across our various nations and parts of the world kind of have to then distribute in some way. I guess two things come to mind as a UK-based academic that seem kind of important. One is that there is such an ability, and there has long been a capacity to just totally overlook empire in education systems in the UK. So what we're dealing with isn't necessarily a sort of situation, I think, often where, to go back to one of the points that was made in the chat, I think it was Tayaba, where at least empire is sort of supposedly good. It's just sort of not really addressed all too often. So, I've just welcomed a new batch of undergrads to Warwick, history undergrads, and many of them have never done anything to do with the British Empire in their school education whatsoever. So I think that one way in which actually we do have a degree of power is by, as university academics, seriously engaging with curriculum reform in secondary education. And I think as a historian, thinking of that as something that can take place outside of the history syllabus, and also often the right place for it is in geography or in other kind of humanities, social science disciplines, and that we might have something to offer there. So I think in a very sort of concrete sense, that's one form of empowerment that isn't empowering Indigenous communities, because I suppose the situation in the UK is so much different, but it is hopefully empowering students to recognize their own positionality vis-a-vis empire a little more, and to understand how that shapes the present in the UK. And I think if there is something that I would like to think could come out of the kind of histories that I think Harriet and I are trying to kind of put forward, and that we're kind of representing, this kind of move in the historiography, it's revealing, I suppose, that these processes of marginalization that place Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples in a sort of lower category and kind of occlude those forms of knowledge and those people was always so number one, it was always incredibly complex. It wasn't just a straightforward writing out. There's this repeated tendency of European empires to make use of and then to occlude and then to overlook, right? And if we sort of miss out the making use of, I think that's we're missing a really major part of the story that could actually be empowering potentially and could be significant. And I suppose also it misses out the fact that these were always contested processes. These weren't just these kind of unilateral, no empire was sufficiently powerful except in very limited circumstances and very limited places, very limited times, to completely marginalized without response. And so I think we can bring to light some counter narratives that I would like to think in a very small way can kind of contribute towards empowerment in the present. I hope that makes sense.
And we have a lot of agreement in the chat. So thank you for that. And as an academic, I agree particularly with the need for curricular reform. In the interest of time, we just have two more questions. One is for Nikki, which was raised in the Q&A. Should we prioritize the convergence of individuals in the high science and high sacred quadrant, or should we engage within this quadrant while acknowledging the existence of alternative narratives or the other quadrants? And if it's the first option, which is prioritizing the high science, high sacred, how can we bring scientists to the sacred? In which ways do you think it would change the way that we do research, that we develop research? Is the quick answer possible? This is a very deep question.
I think the priority is the low science and the low sacred, because they are really the ones who are destroying this world. And the way to engage them is not to convert them, but to see where they dominate and to make sure that we carve a space in that same space. And by that, I mean, whenever a government says, hey, this is something good, in that same spot, we should have our science activist journalists writing immediately after what the cost of that is, because people are getting away. I mean, if there is somebody who brings in so many investments and sells off our country, and now transnational corporations can earn 100% of our mines if they're big ones, they will appear in magazines as technocrats on the cover and win an award. and they're proud of these people. We give them awards. And so I'm not worried about the other spaces as much as the spaces where the greed and destruction is really happening, and we are applauding. I don't want to name names, but we'll just call them technocrats who have brought in so much investment and converted a lot of our lands, and they're public individuals with faces plastered on magazines and glamorized poses and shared on social media as if there was no problem. And so where do they exist, and how can we bombard those same spaces with the effects of what they're doing, is probably how I'd answer this question in an unexpected way.
So the urgent thing is to engage in the low quadrant in a way that will engage their rationalities, right? So we can actually have a conversation. And with that, I'll call on Vandana again for the last question.
Yes, thank you. And I will keep it short, and I'll cut short my closing remarks as well in the interest of time. So my question for Harriet and Tom, thank you for a fascinating talk. Thank you to all the panelists. I loved how, the ideas flowed between your talks as well, although we didn't plan it that way. So Harriet and Tom, I'm just curious that in your researches, have you come across concepts from non-Western dominant epistemologies that would be useful for rescuing climate science from its colonial origins, and perhaps useful for an epistemological shift that is needed?
I don't know if Harry is in a position to talk or not with Marta.
It's a little noisy, but I'm having a good think, because it's a great question.
One thing that immediately comes to mind that I'll just say very quickly, and without any real depth to it, I'm afraid, it concerns, and I think is of interest to this project that we have with colleagues on global temperature as a metric, is the significance across, many distinct communities, particularly in kind of tropical, subtropical locales, the significance of water rather than heat and temperature. And I think that that I would like to see sort of, I mean, it's totally familiar to climate scientists, right? But in terms of public communication of climate sciences, I think at times this sort of overwhelming focus on global temperature serves some purposes, but actually sort of doesn't serve others, and drawing much more on a whole host of kind of colonized indigenous epistemologies concerning water distribution and rainfall, and changes in water distribution over time would seem very relevant to me. I don't know, yeah, something that immediately comes to mind.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Harriet, I don't know if you or Marta have a comment, but
yeah, I think it's something we'll certainly have to think some more about as we take this project further and look at the what we can do with these histories. But what I would say is things like this panel are just such fabulous opportunities when we're bringing together scholars from such different disciplines to talk to each other. And one of the great things about being based where I am and Tom was in a history and philosophy of science department is that where all my students are scientists. So it's actually the first time that I've taught history to scientists, but the conversations are just so rewarding and rich. And I think it would be great to see a bit more of that happening in both directions, actually. So I guess it comes back to a point that's been raised many times today, which is how do we bridge these barriers, these disciplinary boundaries, epistemological boundaries that have been created, and finding creative and I think humbling ways of doing that is a big task, but a really important one. And this is such a great opportunity. Thanks, Vandana.
thank you. Thank you, everyone. Kendra, go ahead.
Yes, and with that closes our question and answer portion. Thank you so much to all our panelists. We've gone a little bit over time, so thank you for your generosity in staying on. The same to our audience who's still with us. So at this point, I'll turn over the floor to Vandana to give a short summary and close our session.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks to our panelists and our wonderful audience and my fellow organizers. This was such a rich discussion that I don't think I've taken copious notes, but I don't think I'm in a good place to actually summarize, except to maybe just touch upon a few things. And tomorrow, when we resume with the next 4 panelists, I'm going to give a summary of what everyone spoke today. That's going to be much more coherent than what I'm saying now. But, so many rich learnings. So, uncertainty versus risk. And what Lyla said about all history is in the present. And the importance of so-called marginalized environments, wastelands that are colonial constructions. And from Nikki's talk, the wind changing direction in so many ways. And I love how you braided your personal story with the story of ideas. And I'm going to be reflecting on the triangle of violence as well as the quadrant. And also this challenge that can scientists think about the sacred? There are non-religious ways to do that too, if you happen to be a non-religious scientist. And so is that something that can reconnect us and remove us from the false objectivity that is such a dominant cornerstone of science into a more participant observer kind of relationship with the universe around us, including the people and the non-human people. And from Tom and Harriet, the 5 key themes that emerge from the research, which remind us that colonialism, we are not actually in a post-colonial era, are we? So colonialism is well and alive in multiple ways. And the necessity for us to have these transdisciplinary conversations to move forward. So I'm just going to end with a couple of notes. One is, can we, all of us here, think about what we've heard, what has been discussed, and walk away with our hearts and minds changed in some fundamental way? And how would that change our lives, the work we do, our interaction with the communities, our relationship with the rest of the universe, with nature? How is today going to change us? And because Nikki mentioned the importance of dreaming different dreams, and keeping in going along with this theme of, having quotes and so on, I'm going to end with a line from one of my favorite poets, a revolutionary poet in India called Sahir Ludhianvi, who said, and I'm going to quote it in Hindi first, who said, "Aao ki koi khab bune kal ke vaste," which means, come, let us dream, come, let us weave dreams for tomorrow's sake. So on that note, thank you, everyone. And I hope to see many of you tomorrow as well.